everyone, so moving over to video number 2, so I'm talking today specifically about non-verbal learning disability, which is not an official diagnosis, but they are campaigning in America, the Non-Verbal Learning Disability Project in America, they are campaigning to get NVLD put in a diagnostic, a statistical manual of mental disorders, so that it can become an official diagnosis. The defining feature of NVLD that everyone agrees on is a massive discrepancy between verbal IQ, which is really high, and performance IQ, which is really low. The greater the discrepancy, the more severe the NVLD. And as I said in the previous video, my discrepancy is so great that I don't even have a full IQ, because that would be absolutely meaningless. My discrepancy is off the charts, so I don't think you get a bigger discrepancy than my one. Basically on a graph, my verbal IQ is right at that end, my performance IQ is right at that end. So I have pretty severe NVLD and pretty classic NVLD, and I basically have pretty much every single symptom, if not now, then certainly when I was growing up. So the symptoms of NVLD, and I'll get on to its relationship to Asperger's in a minute, because I also have Asperger's, although we don't talk. That's probably a topic for another video about why it was a mistake to get rid of Asperger's. So some of the other symptoms then, so I've already mentioned difficulties of spatial skills, problems with organisation, problems with attention, problems with executive functioning, problems with non-verbal communication and motor skills. Specifically, problems with fine motor skills, such as tying shoelaces. That was a massive problem when I was growing up. It took me years to learn how to tie my shoelaces. Spatial awareness at school, it said on my report, I had severe spatial and perceptual difficulties. That's a hallmark of NVLD. It's often termed a spatial disability as well, because it does basically affect spatial understanding. Organisation and planning, that's always been a massive problem for me. That again was listed on my school report, that my organisation skills were very, very poor because I'd just put everything in one place. I still struggle with organisation skills. I often just have things dumped higgledy-piggledy all over the place. I find it very difficult to put things in order. And I hate it, by the way, because I want things to be organised. Because the autism part of me wants things to be organised, but I really struggle to put things into order. That's the NVLD. Problem of staying focused, yes, I do struggle with that. It's always a massive effort staying focused unless I'm in a state of hyper-focus. But initiating tasks and getting into that state of focus can take a hell of a lot of effort and energy, so I spend a lot of time procrastinating. It means I can't just flow seamlessly from one activity to the next, because I often struggle kind of switching attention, and I often end up zoning out and getting overwhelmed by things. Peer relationships, a running theme throughout my life. Reading social cues, a running theme throughout my life. Handling new situations, hate new situations. Facial expressions, not great at reading them unless they're really obvious, and even then I struggle knowing what to do with the information. Problems with idioms, yep. Reading comprehension. Now, reading comprehension was a biggie when I was growing up because my reading abilities were in advance of my years, but my reading comprehension was below my years. So I could read really, really fast, and I learned to read quite young, but I couldn't make sense of what I was reading. That's a hallmark of NVLD, is discrepancy between really good reading ability but really poor reading comprehension. As you can see, I've basically got every single symptom. I need to put it in DSM. Surprise me, Trinity. Essay writing. Yeah, now I can write essays now, but it took me years to learn. When I was at school, my parents used to tell me what to write because I literally had no idea. I really struggled to organise essays because I didn't know how to organise the information, and I found that really, really difficult. So my parents would basically tell me what to write because it didn't come naturally to me. So it took years, really long time, for me to learn how to write an essay. Now I can write essays now, and I can actually write pretty good essays. As anyone will tell you, I'm pretty good at writing essays now, but it still that's because I spent so many years learning, by the way. People don't see how much time it took me to learn this skill, and how much effort my parents put into teaching me how to write essays. As a teenager, it didn't come naturally. It took years. I really, really struggled. I was a late developer. It wasn't until I was about 17 that it finally clicked, and now I can write pretty good essays because I did learn and I picked it up, but it took a really, really long time. And also, if I can write good essays now, it still takes a lot of effort, and it's really draining and exhausting, and it takes me a lot longer to write them than like a typical person because of the amount of processing that needs to go into it. So although the end result could be quite good, the actual processing and time spent on writing the essay can make it really, really exhausting. Charts and diagrams, maps and graphs, yeah, I've always struggled with that. And math skills, really bad at school. That was one of the things they first noticed, was my extremely poor math skills, absolutely no number sense. That's another hallmark of NVLD, by the way, and why it's distinct from Asperger's. But like I said, it's possible to have both, which I do, so I'll come on to that in a moment. But because obviously lots of Asperger's people are really good at maths, but not all of them. But like the NVLD profile, you are going to be really bad at maths. That's kind of like part of it, basically, because the spatial skills affect maths. It's more than just dyscalculia, and NVLD automatically includes dyscalculia as kind of like part of this proposed diagnosis. But obviously someone can have dyscalculia without having NVLD, because you could just have a problem with maths but without all of those other difficulties I've mentioned. So it's more than that, but it does include dyscalculia as part of the profile. So yeah, really bad maths difficulties when I was at school. Okay, because that's all, and that's connected to spatial difficulties, and that was in my school report as well. That's what the educational psychologist said about how my maths difficulties were linked to spatial difficulties. It's also known as developmental visual spatial disorder. That's just another term for NVLD. So you could also call it developmental visual spatial disorder. Means the same thing. So, difficulties with spatial perception, poor executive functions, lots of anxiety. People with NVLD often have extreme anxiety because they often take things literally, and problems regulating emotions. Anxiety is my life. I have such severe anxiety. Inattention, social deficits. So there are social deficits in NVLD, just as there are in Asperger's. But the main difference is the extent of the social difficulties. Because obviously in Asperger's the social difficulties are worse. And also in Asperger's, the social difficulties are combined with rigid and repetitive behaviours, need for routines, and obsessive interests, which you don't find in NVLD. Like I said, I've got both, because I have the obsessive interests, like the Asperger thing, and my social difficulties are more severe than, say, would occur in someone who just had NVLD. But I'll get onto that in a moment. So, because NVLD, the social deficits are more to do with picking up social cues and kind of interpreting facial expressions and a more sort of visual spatial side of social skills, whereas in Asperger's it also goes hand in hand with a mind blindness and difficulties with empathy. So obviously in Asperger's it's a bit more profound, because you also have those difficulties with empathy, and also with Asperger's you have, particularly in childhood, often inappropriate social responses, whereas in NVLD it's a more subtle not being able to read people kind of thing, not being able to read people's faces. But obviously there's a lot of overlap between the two, which is why a lot of researchers suggest there's a link between the two conditions, and that Asperger's and that some people, and that there could be a specific form of Asperger's, which is a particularly severe form of NVLD. But obviously, because now they've basically got rid of Asperger's as a category, it's going to be very hard to disentangle all of this, which is why I think it was so very wrong for them to get rid of Asperger's as a category, because now we're just not going to know anymore. So the syndrome NVLD was first described in 1967 by Johnson and Michaelbust. Whether the condition is valid and discrete clinical entity remains an open question. Well, I think it is, because I basically tick every single box. So yeah, to me it's as real can be, and it'd be great if I get it as an official diagnosis, because it's so accurate for me, it's unreal. So yeah, discrepancy between verbal and spatial ability, verbal grading and performance hallmark features. Larger verbal performance discrepancy scores will associate with increased levels of difficulty with attention, executive function, anxiety and social difficulties. And like I said, I've got extremely profound discrepancies, so no wonder I struggle so much in those areas. A larger Vic discrepancy was associated with greater functional impairment. Yeah, you're telling me. In high IQ children, larger discrepancies result in a greater impairment in cognitive control, attention, anxiety, and social difficulties. So, there are strengths in verbal reasoning, well-developed vocabulary, rote learning skills, and remembering concrete details from a story, but trouble understanding the main idea, the big picture in a narrative. They also struggle with life skills that require understanding of spatial relationships, for example, recognising how parts fit together in a whole, completing jigsaw puzzles, which I really struggled with, I couldn't do that at all when I was a kid, and building with blocks. That was the health history for mentioning that to my mum when I was 18 months, so I didn't do it properly. Fine motor control deficits, as I've already mentioned, tying shoelaces, problems using small tools, executive functioning and attention deficits, trouble handling new tasks, solving problems, staying focused, completing multi-step instructions, organising tasks, academic difficulties, learning maths concepts, reading comprehension, This is like reading a story of my life, some will. Poor spatial skills, difficulty building blocks, I've already mentioned, problems with essay writing, organising ideas, manipulating objects in space, such as tying shoelaces. So a person with NVLD will be great at understanding the individual words of a story and the concrete details, but not the main idea. So there are difficulties recognising how parts fit together into whole, which can mean they struggle with completing jigsaws and manipulating objects in space, because that's all to do with spatial relationships, which is a hallmark difficulty. Problems in understanding part-whole relationships or big picture thinking, and it's postulated that this is due to an impairment in the right hemisphere of the brain. So, some believe that Asperger syndrome and NVLD are linked, as they have very similar symptoms, and there's also the fact that a person can have both Asperger's and NVLD. Like I said, I have both. I'm diagnosed autistic, but obviously Asperger's is the more precise terminology, but we don't use that anymore. And obviously NVLD is not a diagnosis currently, but it's clear and obvious that I have the hallmark features. So if it is a diagnosis, I'd obviously have it, because I have the high VIX, low PIC, and all the other things I just talked about, which is essential. So I have both. But it is possible for someone to have Asperger's without NVLD, because obviously some people with Asperger's are actually great at jigsaw puzzles, solving maths problems, and all of those things, and they don't have that learning disability. So it's possible to have Asperger's without NVLD, and it's possible to have NVLD without Asperger's. If you had NVLD without Asperger's, you wouldn't have the associated intense obsessive interests, need for routine, and the repetitive behaviours that occur in Asperger's, and your social difficulties won't be quite as severe as, say, in Asperger's. So I guess both Asperger's and NVLD on their own would be less severe than the two together, and I obviously have both together, which is part of the reason why my condition is so severe. And also, of course, in Asperger's you have the sensory difficulties, which are a bit more profound, you can say, in NVLD as well. So thank you for watching.